The Middle East is used to tension. It has lived under the shadow of conflict for so long that buildup often feels like background noise. Ships move, statements are issued, forces posture and pull back. Most of the time, the rhythm is familiar enough to ignore, until suddenly it isn't. This time, the movement carries weight. Far from public view, a massive shape cuts through open water, its presence tracked not by headlines, but by satellites and secure briefings. The largest class of U.S. aircraft carrier is advancing toward a region already strained by distrust and fatigue. On its deck, rows of fighter jets sit prepared, silent and immaculately ordered. Below, command centers hum with constant activity. Nothing about this deployment is accidental. Nothing about it is casual. An aircraft carrier is never just transportation. It is autonomy. It is reach. It is a self-contained projection of power that answers to no host nation and requires no permission to operate. When one moves into contested space, it brings the capability to reshape events in hours, not days, and everyone watching understands that, especially Iran. There are no public alarms, no visible panic, but tension rarely announces itself. Inside secure facilities, calculations are already underway. Radar coverage is being reviewed. Response times are being measured down to the minute. Commanders know that a carrier changes the geometry of risk. Fixed distances collapse. Warning windows shrink. Assumptions that once felt stable suddenly feel exposed. What makes this moment dangerous isn't the carrier itself, it's what it represents. Unlike land bases, a carrier doesn't stay put. It can appear where it isn't expected. It can reposition faster than diplomacy can react. It can strike without crossing borders or triggering early political warnings. That mobility forces adversaries into a permanent state of anticipation, and anticipation is exhausting. Over time, it erodes judgment. This is the quiet power of deterrence, pressure applied not through action, but through possibility. For Iran, the challenge is layered. Years of planning have gone into countering superior naval forces through asymmetric means. Missiles, drones, electronic warfare, regional leverage. These tools are designed to complicate any attack and raise the cost of escalation. But deterrence is not static. It relies on belief, the belief that retaliation will be effective and that the other side will hesitate. A carrier tests that belief. As it moves closer, the airspace around it becomes more active. Surveillance aircraft extend their orbits. Electronic systems scan and probe, mapping reactions without crossing overt lines. Fighters train for rapid launch scenarios that may never be needed, but must always be ready. None of this is visible to the public. All of it is deliberate. This is not peace. It is controlled strain. Public statements, meanwhile, remain carefully measured. Words like stability and security are repeated, chosen for their ability to calm without committing. No one admits to preparing for the worst, even as preparations accelerate quietly, because admitting it would force acknowledgement that the margin for error is shrinking, and it is. In a high-alert environment, ambiguity becomes dangerous. A radar anomaly, a delayed response, a maneuver interpreted incorrectly. These are not dramatic acts, but they can force decisions that cannot be reversed. Modern military doctrine prioritizes speed. Speed rewards decisiveness. It punishes hesitation. And when both sides operate under that logic, restraint becomes harder to maintain. The carrier's presence amplifies every signal. For regional allies, it is reassurance. For rivals, it is a warning. For everyone else, it is a reminder that escalation does not need intent to begin. Only momentum. Markets sense this before governments do. Energy prices react, shipping calculations change, insurance costs rise quietly, then suddenly. The effects spread outward long before any missile is launched. Iran's leadership understands this pattern. They have seen how quickly perception can harden into reality, how forces positioned just in case begin to define what comes next. When assets are in place, leaders face pressure to justify them, to demonstrate resolve, to avoid appearing reactive rather than prepared. This is the trap of presence. Once power is displayed, it demands interpretation. The most unsettling aspect of this deployment is that it may be designed not to act at all, to exist as a constant variable in every equation, a reminder that any move could trigger a response too large to contain. Deterrence in its purest form is about convincing the other side that inaction is the safest choice. But deterrence relies on mutual understanding, and understanding is fragile. Iran's defensive systems remain active, scanning skies and seas for changes. Missile units adjust readiness levels. Cyber capabilities remain poised, watching for intrusion. None of this means an attack is imminent. It means that no one can afford to assume it isn't. That state of uncertainty is corrosive. It wears down decision-makers. It shortens tempers. It makes misjudgment more likely. The region has lived through moments like this before. Times when forces gathered, waited, and ultimately pulled back. Times when tension dissipated without consequence. But history also remembers moments when similar buildups ended very differently. When a single incident shattered restraint and set events in motion faster than leaders could stop them. What feels different now is speed. Information moves instantly. Decisions are expected immediately. There is less room to pause, to clarify, to de-escalate. A commander may have minutes to interpret data that is incomplete by nature, and in those minutes, the weight of expectation can outweigh caution. The carrier continues forward. On deck, pilots review procedures they hope not to use. Below, crews monitor systems that never sleep. Across the water, Iranian defenses remain alert, watching patterns, noting changes, waiting for signs that may never come or may come without warning. This is how history often positions itself, not at the moment of action, but at the moment just before, when nothing has happened yet, but everything is ready to, when the absence of conflict feels as heavy as its presence. Whether this deployment becomes a stabilizing force or a catalyst depends on choices made quietly, far from public view, choices shaped by pressure, perception, and the belief that control can be maintained. For now, the silence holds. But silence, under this much strain, is never neutral. Once forces settle into a high-alert posture, time starts behaving differently. Days feel compressed, hours stretch thin. Every update carries weight, not because it confirms anything, but because it might. The longer the carrier remains in position, the more its presence reshapes expectations on both sides.
This is where tension becomes self-sustaining. Military systems are designed to interpret anomalies as threats until proven otherwise, a signal out of place, a movement slightly off pattern, a test that occurs at the wrong moment. None of these are acts of war, but all of them demand attention, and attention, once fixed, narrows perspective. Alternatives fade. The range of acceptable responses shrinks. In this environment, intent matters less than perception. A surveillance drone launched for routine monitoring can look like preparation. A naval maneuver meant to signal resolve can feel like encirclement. Each side insists it is responding defensively, even as its actions raise the stakes. Escalation doesn't arrive as a decision, it arrives as a sequence, and sequences are hard to stop once they begin. The greatest risk is not a planned strike, it's the unscripted moment, an encounter at sea that unfolds too quickly for calm interpretation, a radar lock that lasts a second longer than expected, a warning transmitted, received, and misunderstood. In a region already saturated with distrust, these moments carry disproportionate force. If such an incident occurs, the response would be immediate. Airspace would tighten, forces would disperse or concentrate depending on doctrine, allies would shift readiness levels without public explanation, statements would lag behind events, carefully worded and intentionally vague. By the time clarity emerges, positions would already be set. This is how crises harden. The presence of a carrier strike group complicates every calculation. Its layered defenses reduce vulnerability, but they also encourage confidence. Confidence can invite risk. When a force believes it can absorb retaliation, thresholds shift. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel manageable. And when both sides adjust their thresholds simultaneously, the margin for error disappears. Regionally, the consequences would cascade. Shipping lanes would become contested in practice, if not in name. Energy infrastructure would operate under constant threat perception. Insurance markets would react instantly, long before any physical disruption occurs. Economic pressure would build quietly, affecting decisions far removed from the original standoff. Politically, leaders would face competing pressures. To de-escalate risks appearing weak, to escalate risks catastrophe. Domestic audiences demand strength, allies demand assurance, rivals test resolve. In this pressure cooker, restraint requires not just will, but credibility, the ability to pull back without inviting challenge. That is difficult when so much is already in motion. For Iran, the calculus is especially complex. Its strategy relies on demonstrating that escalation would not remain contained, that any strike would ripple outward through the region. But the very presence of a carrier challenges that logic. It suggests an opponent prepared for wider consequences, not deterred by them. This is where miscalculation becomes most likely, not because one side wants war, but because each side believes the other will blink first. History is crowded with moments where that belief proved disastrous, where leaders assumed rationality would prevail, only to discover too late that pressure had narrowed choices beyond recovery. The Middle East has absorbed those lessons before, yet each generation faces its own version of the test. Technology changes the speed, information changes the scale, but the core dynamic remains the same. Power positioned too close, under too much strain, with too little room for error. There is still a path where nothing happens, where the carrier eventually turns away, where readiness degrades slowly back into routine, where this moment becomes another near miss, studied quietly and then set aside. That outcome depends on patience, communication, and a shared interest in avoiding the unknown. But even that outcome leaves a mark. Each buildup normalizes the next. Each standoff lowers the threshold for future deployments. The exceptional becomes expected. Over time, the region adjusts to a higher baseline of tension, and the cost of misjudgment grows alongside it. This is the legacy of constant readiness. The aircraft carrier remains at sea, its presence undeniable, its intent deliberately opaque. Around it, systems continue to run, crews remain alert, commanders continue to assess not just capabilities, but psychology. Across the water, Iranian defenses maintain vigilance, reading every movement for meaning. Nothing has happened, and yet, everything feels closer to happening than before. This is the paradox of modern deterrence, peace maintained not by trust, but by fear of consequence, stability achieved not through resolution, but through exhaustion. It can hold for long periods, until it doesn't. When history looks back on moments like this, it often finds no single turning point, no dramatic declaration, just a slow convergence of forces, perceptions, and pressures that made one outcome more likely than anyone intended. Right now, that convergence is still incomplete. The silence remains intact, the jets stay grounded, the missiles remain unfired. But the weight of possibility hangs over every calculation, every watch shift, every decision made in rooms without windows. Whether this chapter ends quietly or violently depends on choices unfolding in real time, choices shaped by uncertainty, pride, and the belief that control is still possible. The carrier continues its patrol. The region holds its breath, and history waits to see which assumption breaks first.